This was the River Meavy. Throughout the Middle Ages, people on this very spot would stream for tin. Just like this. Black tin. Now, experienced tinners knew precisely where to look to find these little nuggets of black gold. It didn't actually matter to them whether places like this belonged to somebody else. They were at perfect liberty to go wherever they pleased on the moor and take whatever they needed from the streams. Woe betide anyone who tried to stop them. Now calm down, calm down. This isn't yet another programme about tin mining. No, it's about prisoners and prisons. And despite its pleasant appearance, this pretty little place was one of the worst in the West Country. You most definitely didn't want to do time here. Look, I'm sure you don't really need me to tell you that throughout history in the West Country, thousands of people were actively involved in tin mining. I mean, tin was an enormously important commodity. Pewter, for example, I mean, that's 98% pure tin. Well, given that it was that important to the economy, it should come as no surprise that the Crown took an active interest in taxing the profits of the industry to the absolute hilt. No monarch worth his salt in this country would ever allow anything to interrupt the smooth running of the tin industry. That's why they went to the trouble of passing a very special set of laws, a set of laws that only applied in the tin mining districts of the West Country. The very harsh but wonderfully effective stannery laws. Now, this is a very rare 18th century book, and I've got it not just because it goes with the outfit, but because it lists all the stannery laws going right the way back to the reign of James I in the early 1600s. Listen to this. We present and affirm that writs of prohibition lie in the stannery court in cases of land, life, and limb, and that the writ of habeas corpus and of corpus cum causa, whatever that means, doth likewise lie with the stannery courts. Be in no doubt whatsoever, if you got the wrong side of stannery law, you were in big trouble. You were likely to end up in Lidford jail.
Lidford Castle is an absolutely fascinating place. It looks like an ordinary castle on top of a green mound, but in fact its history is much more interesting than that. It started off as a military prison and is the earliest purpose-built prison surviving in this country. We have a remarkable record in 1195 to a strong house that was actually built here for the king to house his prisoners. And we know that in the 13th century, in 1209, French prisoners were actually incarcerated in this very place. But perhaps its most interesting aspect from the historical point of view is the fact that it was the Tinners' jail. The lower part of the castle, which is completely hidden from the roadside, was the dungeon and jail that the Tinners used. And the most famous incident, perhaps, was that when the Tinners actually imprisoned Richard Strode, who was MP for the borough of Plimpton. He was annoyed by certain Tinners who started digging for tin, probably on his own land, and he tried to introduce a bill into the Westminster Parliament to prevent the Tinners actually working close to the main rivers that led towards Plymouth. So the Tinners arrested him somehow, we don't know, and brought him to Lidford jail, and he described the place as a dungeon and a deep pit under the ground, and the most annoyous, contagious, and detestable place within this realm. Lidford law, or stannery law, has an evil reputation for severity. And in the mid-17th century, a poet of Tavistock called William Browne left a couple of verses which describe Stanley Law and Lidford. I oft have heard of Lidford Law, how in the morn they hang and draw, and sit in judgment after. At first I wondered at it much, but now I find their reason such that it deserves no laughter. They have a castle on a hill.
I took it for an old windmill, vanes blown off by weather. Then lie therein one night, 'tis guessed 'tis better to be stoned or pressed or hanged. Now choose you whether. 10 men less room within this cave than 5 mice in a lantern have. The keepers, they're the sly ones. And one keeper in particular, a gentleman by the name of Sir Richard Grenville, one of my favourite characters from the English Civil War. I say favourite, but let's be under no illusions. A modern criminal psychologist would describe Richard Grenville as a thoroughly nasty piece of work. He was a professional soldier with all a professional soldier's bad habits from those days. He would string up prisoners of war at the drop of a hat. And unfortunately, someone saw fit to put him in charge of prisoners of war in this very prison. One gentleman by the name of Yolland, and we'll never know what it was he did to offend Sir Richard, but it must have been pretty serious, because poor old Yolland was dumped in a cell very much like this, possibly even this one, and was starved to death. I think you've got to have upset someone pretty badly for them to go to all the trouble of taking such a long-winded way of taking you out of the equation. But then it was Sir Richard Grenville, and this was Lidford. Lidford was the most notorious prison in the entire West Country. But the West Country's most notorious prisoner never saw the inside of a jail. A prisoner so infamous that thousands of sightseers thronged the Devonport dockyard to try and catch a glimpse of him as the Navy escorted him into exile on the other side of the world. He was the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. But you know, the thing you mustn't forget is that while his nibs was out there in the Sound being kept in right royal state, the poor soldiers and sailors who'd put the imperial crown on his head in the first place, but who'd had the misfortune to be taken prisoner by the British, had been kept in prison hulks out there. These were dismasted and generally derelict ships of the line that the Navy had no further use for, so into them they tumbled thousands of French prisoners. And it has to be said that despite their filthy French habits, the conditions on board those hulks were truly appalling. The conditions on those ships were so vile that on one celebrated occasion, the Plymouth and District Association of Ships' Rats and Allied Rodents actually sent a formal delegation up to London to lodge an official complaint with the Health and Safety Executive. Only kidding. The point I'm trying to make is that conditions as bad as that meant that not only would they breed disease, but they would breed a very real indiscipline, which the French officers found intolerable. If they were going to keep control of their soldiers, they needed to do something about it. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, there was a room in this very building that was handed over to the exclusive use of the French prisoners of war. It was a room where they executed those of their own men who'd been found guilty of crimes against the French military code and had been condemned by courts-martial to be hanged until dead. Now, we don't know exactly how many people were executed here, but several years back, a group of 149 nails were found in what looked suspiciously like a tally, hammered and grouped into the wall, in this very room. 149 separate occasions, these cold brick walls echoed to the subdued silences of a military execution. The meaningless mumble of the parson, the whispered orders of the petty officer, his harsh quarterdeck voice, suddenly gentle. And from below, the chill, uncaring clink of the surgeon's tools as he set them out on the dissecting slab, and the dry rustle as the knot was placed firmly against the left ear of the condemned man. And then the sound that not a single one of them would ever forget. And then there'd be the long, interminable minutes as the body struggled against the endless fall down into the darkness, and the officers would pretend to look at their watches, and when the rope was finally still, then they knew that the candle of life had guttered and died.
Conditions on the prison hulks were so bad that eventually even the government felt something had to be done about it. The solution was provided by Sir Thomas Tyrwhitt, a well-connected Georgian wheeler dealer whose dream of building a huge prison depot in the wilderness, which he just happened to own, produced the most famous jail in Britain, Dartmoor Prison. The Dartmoor depot was designed and built to hold 5,000 prisoners of war. But within 4 years of it being opened, and I'm sure this will come as no surprise to any prison officers watching, by 1813 there were over 9,000 prisoners packed into the place. Now, fair enough, they were only Frenchmen, but let's be honest, even that's a bit over the top. I mean, these walls are granite moorstone, not stretch lycra.
When the French prisoners of war arrived at Dartmoor, they very rapidly established their own social order. At the top was a group known as Les Lords. Many of them were so well regarded that they were able to live in parole within the local community but outside the confines of the prison wall. At the very bottom, though, of the social order was a group known as Les Romains, and they were prisoners who gambled away all their belongings and relied upon the pity of others to survive. In the middle was a class of artisan prisoners who were able to live by helping the upper class prisoners, by doing work for them, cleaning, cooking, but also by making items which they could sell to the local people who used to visit the prison on special market days. And they made all manner of intricate and very delicate items from bones from their food, crosses, rings, and this small delicate box. Some of the larger items made by prisoners, such as model sailing ships, would be worth many thousands of pounds today. But of course in those days they were traded merely for food in the market inside the prison. In those days it was very convenient for the local people to come and trade with the prisoners, because outside there was only a little hamlet at Princetown, but inside there was a large captive market of prisoners desperate for trading for food or anything else that they could get for the things they made.
The problem for the soldiers guarding the prisoners was that if outsiders were allowed inside, and then the insiders managed to get outside, the soldiers would end up having to turn the entire moor inside out, trying to get them back inside again. And soldiers hate being outside in bad weather when they could be inside with a pint, so they kept a close watch on those frog-eating Frenchies. Now, if the regime for French prisoners of war wasn't anything like as strict as it would have been for civilian criminals, this place wasn't Centre Parks by any stretch of the imagination. This wall was designed to stop the prisoners getting out, but there was a minor design feature in it that did allow the locals to come in. This was the lintel of a doorway through which local traders would come on a regular basis to have markets where the prisoners could sell off their goods. Now, one of the French prisoners really did leave his mark on this place. He carved his name and the fact that he was a prisoner here in 1813, and he carved it over the lintel of the doorway. The doorway presented a marvellous opportunity for the prisoners and the locals to mix, but it presented an even better opportunity to one prisoner in particular, who decided that he had a cunning plan to get out of this place. Louis Van Eel's escape plan was fabulously French. It had audacity, it had flair, it had panache, and it had the guards looking complete plonkers. With any luck, the only bars he'd ever see again were the ones selling champagne in Montmartre. Actually, it wasn't a cunning plan at all. They don't come any simpler. He acquired himself some fine civilian clothes, and when the crowds were going home at the end of the day, he simply toddled off out the door with them, being very careful to remember to say cheerio to the guards rather than au revoir. Off he went, large as life and twice as cheerful. Louis made it all the way to the West Indies, and then his luck ran out. It breaks me heart to tell you, but the darling boy was recaptured and sent all the way back to sunny Dartmoor. But compared to some, he was lucky. Many of his mates died in prison and were buried in unmarked graves. But there's one grave in Ashburton churchyard that still has a tale to tell. Well, we all know how Napoleon's imperial ambitions were brought down in ruins on the fields of Waterloo. And not long afterwards, the Allies sent him off into exile on St. Helena. But while he was on his way, most of the prisoners who'd been the unwilling guests of His Britannic Majesty George III here in England were packed off back to France. All except the ones, that is, who'd married local girls and were busily selling croissants on Morton Hampstead Market. And of course, those poor soldiers who were never going to go home. Time had run out for the Emperor back in June at Waterloo. And it wasn't until 3 months later that it finally ran out for one of his soldiers, a Lieutenant Francois Guidon. He was a lieutenant in the 16th Regiment of the Line. The difference is that whereas the Emperor had led a full and eventful life, poor Francois was a mere 22 years of age when they laid him in the ground. Laid him in a far-off corner of a foreign field. That's forever France. And even in death, the Emperor casts his shadow over Francois, because the tree that grows here was grown from a cutting from the very tree that marked Napoleon's grave on St. Helena. This is all very curious. This looks distinctly like a French chateau to me. No, it has to be Bodmin Jail. That's spelt the correct way, by the way. Gaol. Now, back in the 1960s, this place was being run as a nightclub. Back in the 1860s, they were swinging people in an entirely different way. As the Industrial Revolution got up a full head of steam, Cornwall was flooded by people from up country who came in search of work. No change there then. And not all of them were hard-working, law-abiding folk. So the good subjects of the duchy got a tourist development grant and built themselves a brand spanking new prison, designed to offer the very last word in accommodation to the more discerning members of the criminal classes. All rooms had balls, chains and treadmills en suite. The judiciary at the time might have hailed these places as model penal institutes, but be under no illusions that life for those inside them was incredibly hard, despite the fact that they were technically only minor offenders. And it got worse. If you actually transgressed the rules of the prison itself, in addition to the sentence you were already serving, they could make life distinctly unpleasant for you by chaining you up, chaining you to the wall in total darkness. And they were the lucky ones, because just a few yards down from where I'm standing is the condemned man's cell. For them, life in prison chained to a wall in utter darkness was distinctly the soft option.
Well, the first Bodmin Jail was completed in 1779. Previously, the prisoners were kept in Launceston Castle, but conditions in Launceston Castle got so bad that there was the need for a purpose-built jail. And the authorities decided that Bodmin, being more central to Cornwall than Launceston, they would build a jail in Bodmin. The crimes that people would have been in the jail for would have been things such as, to start off with, would have been just vagrancy, brawling in the streets, drunken disorderly, fighting. That would have obviously been a sentence of several weeks or even several months. And then, of course, causing bodily harm, that would have been a very serious offence, and they would have probably been in for maybe 6 months or something like that. But records show us that people were hung for stealing a sheep, setting fire to a corn stack, stealing a watch. Now, they were hanging offences, so it would appear that you either came in for 6 months or you were hung.
Now, at the risk of sounding pompous, I have to say I find jokes about public hangings in particularly poor taste. 19th century executions were no laughing matter. Well, leastways not for the stars of those particular shows. Oh, this place is amazing, isn't it? You know, back in the 1840s, two young lads who came and enjoyed the splendid hospitality of this commodious establishment were the Lightfoot brothers. They decided, for reasons best known to themselves, to take up a career in highway robbery. The only problem was that they displayed a spectacular ineptitude at their chosen profession. On their very first attempt, they managed to get the money all right. Sadly, they left the chap concerned dead at the side of the road. In the course of time, they were brought to Bodmin Jail and billed as the star attraction at a public hanging. I mean, public hangings in those days were huge entertainments. In fact, on the morning that the Lightfoots were scheduled to be topped, the local train company actually laid on special trains to bring in the crowds. Seriously, that's exactly what they did. While the poor old Lightfoot brothers were waiting to dance the Newgate hornpipe at noon, the morning would have seen a huge crowd gathering in a fairground atmosphere. There have been folk singers selling broadsheet ballads. There have been tinkers selling working models of the gibbet and other educational toys. And if you were really gullible, you'd have been able to buy yourself a couple of inches of the rope that had been used in the previous hanging. You could bet your life it had been cut off the chandler's stock first thing that morning, but people bought it nonetheless because wearing it round the neck they thought brought them good luck. In fact, I've often wondered if Jack Rattenbury, the famous smuggler, had a piece of hangman's rope round his neck, because on the day that he was being brought to Bodmin Jail, he managed to effect a very lucky, not to say miraculous, escape from his jailers over at Indian Queens. Ah, but that, as they say, is another story.
Next week at the same time, our series that takes us from the bomb to the Beatles continues with eyewitness accounts looking at how the Festival of Britain, the Coronation and the Beverley Sisters brought some colour into post-war Britain.